Oh my goodness, we are running 1 minute and 30 seconds early by my clock. That's amazing.
Definitely. Hooray. Okay, very good. I will go ahead and mute and turn off my camera, and I will be here just to facilitate questions.
Excellent, thank you. I'm going to give it a few more minutes for more folks to log on, since we are probably one of the few electronic workshops I've ever been to that's running early. Um, let's see. Would anyone like to introduce themselves or ask any questions that they already have about this subject in the chat? The subject is the birthing dark, which is you might have noticed are in some pretty dark times right now. It's a very interesting time for transformation, when things that maybe were not possible a year ago now are possible, but there's also a lot of loss and grief and trauma going on, and a lot of trauma being processed that's been going on for a long time that maybe hasn't been processed and let out so far. So this talk and workshop is about how we can do grief work, which is a term I love because our society doesn't really encourage grief work or ever talk about it. I think the first time I ever heard the term was this year. And then I realized that that is something I had been doing actually for a long time, but I had had no words for. And I didn't know that it was a thing. And I didn't know that our whole society probably kind of needs it. Um, so I'm going to, unless anyone has any burning questions they'd like to ask, I'm going to share my screen. My slides are not full of bright, colorful pictures, but I know some people are very visual. Oh, wonderful. Cat B says she's learning how to hold space for generational and inherited trauma, and that is such an interesting subject. My family has a lot of that, and it's very interesting because it's very different from, for example, the trauma of colonized peoples, but seeing the trauma that has been inflicted on my family by the same empires, and how that has continued to cause trauma down our generations, has also been very interesting. And thank you everyone for coming. This is a difficult subject, but it's an important one, especially during this time, because 2020 has just been, everything. So I'm going to get my very simple presentation up. Can everyone see my presentation? If anyone cannot, can the moderator give me a heads up? All right.
Okay, it looks good to me.
Wonderful, wonderful. I appreciate it. I'll take that as so far so good. So the birthing dark, the turning dark, is a term originally from Starhawk's Dreaming the Dark, which is a wonderful, wonderful book, by the way. It is her less well-known work, but it is really incredible. It's about her experience with magic and community and political activism, and the time she actually spent blockading the site where a nuclear power plant was scheduled to be built on top of a fault line. So it's about some very powerful work that they did, and how they kind of explore how the things that we might not be comfortable looking at, or the things that might be a little bit painful, if we play our cards right, can actually bring us closer together rather than taking us further apart. And I wanted to open with some really powerful quotes about grief, because I'll bet anyone who's here today has a lot of grief and trauma, even just from the last year, whether it's a loved one that you have lost, to either arguments or passing over, whether it's a grief for the environment, which is really acute in the Puget Sound area right now, unfortunately, or whether it's grief about the police brutality and the really violent sentiments that are going on around the country right now. We all have a lot to process. I don't think there's anyone here who's going to be like, I don't have any grief to process at all. And I also wanted to say that the point of this presentation is not to bypass or minimize grief. You might have heard the term spiritual bypassing going around in some circles lately, and that's this idea that the kind of love and light spirituality, when taken to excess, can actually eclipse the work that we need to do in darkness. And it can be especially harmful when there are people who might have more trauma than others and might feel like they're being told, oh, we'll just move past this. It's all part of the plan, et cetera, et cetera. So that is what we're trying not to do here. So if anyone, moderator, says anything in the chat to the effect of, I feel like you're minimizing this, could you please stop and can we talk about something? Please let me know, because that is helping this work. What we need to do for grief work is to dwell in when we dwell in loss, we are dwelling in the importance of the things that need to happen. So that is a place that we want to be more maybe than our culture generally allows us. So these are some wonderful quotes that I cannot take credit for. Some are unknown. Grief means you are excellent at loving. We need to grieve the ones we've lost, not to sustain our connection to suffering, but to sustain our connection to love. The only way out of grief is through, and the only way through is together. And I think that's so, so important for us to remember during this time, because what is the conditioning that our society puts on us? Don't cry. That's not the best thing to say, as we'll cover soon. We have a couple more quotes here. Grief opens a place in our hearts that we never knew could hurt so profoundly, but it also opens the same place to a love we never imagined possible. There is a sacredness in tears. They are not the mark of weakness, but of strength. They speak more eloquently than 10,000 tongues. They are the mark of overwhelming grief, a deep contrition, and of unspeakable love. And by the way, I will later distribute my mailing list link, and I will send this PowerPoint to anyone who would like a copy of it. So the question is, why am I showing you these quotes? We need to talk about the dark places that are going on, that a lot of us are in right now, and how we need to maybe dwell a little more in those than we have been. Some of us might have already been sitting in them for too long, but for many of us, our first impulse is to avoid these places, and that actually prevents valuable work from being done. I've already addressed spiritual bypassing a little bit. And, the older I get, the more my motto becomes all things in moderation. You can't grow without both light and darkness. You can't grow without the hope that there is work that can be done, and you can't grow without the recognition that it needs to be done, because things are not okay as they are. And so the question for us becomes, what does darkness look like? There are a lot of manifestations we see, but ultimately it's all wrapped up in grief. Two of our most common responses to loss or to things not going our way are grief and anger. And they both have their place. Anger can be a very powerful motivator to fight for what is right. But sometimes in our culture, we might feel, and this is especially true for people on the male side of the spectrum. So I want to say this, we might feel that that's the only expression we are allowed to have. And women might feel the opposite. We might feel that we are not allowed to be angry, which is equally problematic. So, all things in moderation, right? I think it's valuable to look at which, between grief and anger, do we feel like we are less allowed to feel? Because whichever one we feel like we are less allowed to feel, that's probably where there is some liberating work to be done. Moderator, do we have any burning questions at the moment?
We just have a comment from Colleen that darkness isn't all negative. It's also fertile and lots of positive connotations.
That's very true. That's very true. It's an interesting thing to negotiate because many people, I'm actually one of them. I'm a priestess of Loki, so I experience darkness as having a lot of positive connotations, but I also do feel like in this time we need to address that that's not all there is, because goodness knows there's a lot going on that needs to be processed. So the power of grief is something that we don't talk about a lot. My background before I was doing this work was actually in neuroscience and clinical research. And these are not the facts that we feel in a way that will help us, but they are good to have for our logical minds to know that science is supporting us here. Recent scientific studies of crying and grief have concluded that tears are evolution's way of telling someone we need help. They are involuntary and usually can't be faked. And the response that most people seem to have is to actually dial back their own aggression or desires and engage with the person who's grieving in a new way. One of the studies that scientists did, because science, was actually exposing people to tears that had been collected in another room. And they actually found that even if the person did not know that what they were looking at was a product of grief, there were chemicals in the tears that still affected their responses, and their kind of mediated their more aggressive impulses. So that's all very interesting for us to know. Tears also heal us. They actually can act as sort of an overflow valve for the neurotransmitters that cause painful emotions. And when we grieve together, the bonds that are formed through shared grief are actually the most powerful bonds, at least according to a lot of grief counselors out there. And that's all really interesting when we consider that our society discourages crying and discourages public grief, at least in most of our subcultures, because these are things that we are being actively discouraged from doing. And, no one talks about grief work unless perhaps some specific ministries.
There's a comment.
Yes.
When we associate darkness with negativity, we can unintentionally reinforce racial biases.
Oh, that's an excellent point. Thank you for pointing that out. And I'd like to open the floor to some interesting questions here, because I have not heard a similar kind of linguistic construct. Does anyone have suggestions for a different kind of linguistic construct to kind of talk about the painful work that we have to do.
We'll give everyone a moment to kind of think on that.
Thank you. Yeah, that is an unfortunate connotation. And I don't like to necessarily refer to these things as negative either, because they are not pleasant experiences, but they are, I believe, positive experiences to the extent that they cause, hopefully, change for the better to happen. And they are part and parcel of experiencing a lot of positive things. So I definitely agree with the concern about conflating darkness with this work, but I almost don't want to use the word negative either, because it's something where we want to avoid it by doing the right thing, but it's also something that, we are mortal and fallible and we can't necessarily avoid. So the idea that these painful aspects are negative or to be avoided doesn't feel helpful to me at all. What do you viewers think?
From Patty, I envision reaching deep into the roots where sight is absent rather than brightness or darkness.
I like that. I like that.
From Colleen, darkness is a metaphor for overwhelm and pain.
Okay. Okay, that's interesting. And I'm glad that that was brought up, because that's something that we definitely want to be conscious of. By the way, everyone in the audience, Harvard has an implicit bias survey that is very interesting. It's actually, they have a whole series of them, and it is actually a concrete way to be able to measure things like subconscious racial bias that we have. So if anyone out there has not taken that, you can Google the Harvard implicit bias survey. And I find that's a nice link to keep handy, because it's a way to kind of quantify that and demonstrate that it is a real thing to people. And they have, I've worked mostly with the racial one, but they have several implicit bias surveys to kind of quantify and demonstrate different types of bias that we need to be aware of. So do we have any other burning questions or comments before we move on? All right, I'm not seeing any more notifications, and thank you for bringing that up, because it is important that we be mindful of our language in that way. And this slide, many of you have probably read it. When we experience grief, we are also able to experience new feelings. And we're actually going to see some very interesting quotes from the Greek heroic sagas about that. I saw a really wonderful article recently in which some civil rights activists were interviewed, and they were envisioning a way of moving forward where we move forward not by shouting at each other. Obviously, that needs to happen sometimes, but the most powerful way they felt was listening to each other's grief and seeing, just seeing what the people around us are experiencing. This is definitely true of most of the people on my Facebook wall, that they prefer to talk rather than listen. And one of the reasons we have such a hard time communicating about grief is that it's not always something that can be most efficiently expressed in words. So it's something that listening and holding space for, which can be more challenging on the internet than typing streams of paragraphs, is the best way to communicate in this way. The idea of grief as work may be new to a lot of us because there is this very pervasive cultural sensation that grief is something that we want to either avoid or get through as fast as possible. And when we don't take the time to do grief work, there's actually important work that isn't being done. Grief is not a moment of weakness or a sign of failure. It's a sign of love and hope. And it's work that requires tremendous strength, especially when you have a society that may not be super friendly to it. How are our comments looking, moderator?
I just posted a link to the survey that you mentioned.
Oh, thank you so much.
No other comments at this time.
All right. The question of why grief work has been sort of demonized and illegitimized is very interesting because, like all things, what appears to be a bug in our society might actually be a feature. Removing our emphasis on taking time to process personal losses takes away from our personal power. It takes away from our perception of the value of relationships and of individual lives. So if you've got, workers running a factory and you're the factory owner, maybe you don't want them to all stop and figure out what changes needs to happen because someone perhaps has a workplace accident. There is incentive for minimizing grief that isn't condoned by the powers that be, so to speak. But if we look back to the pre-industrial era, we see a lot of celebrations of grief as strength. Many of the heroic epics, which I think many of us in the West think of as like our Western prototype of manly men, were characterized by grief and by crying. Achilles and Odysseus shed a lot of manly tears for fallen brethren, for their city states, for all kinds of things. And if you read the text, you notice that what often happens is that before doing this grief work, they can be paralyzed, they can be unsure what to do. But after the grief work is done, they can move forward and take new action. And these are actually some direct quotes from a few translations of the heroic myths. We see, his cheeks were soon wet with tears as his feelings suddenly broke loose. He would have wept himself away in the distance that no trace of his existence might remain. Amid the deep-drawn sighs he seemed to recover. The soft, serene air penetrated him. The world was again present to his senses, and thoughts of other times began to speak to him in consolation. And then we have a quote referring to Odysseus in the Odyssey and one of his brethren. They were both so much moved that they cried aloud like eagles or vultures with crooked talons that have been robbed of their half-fledged young by peasants. Thus piteously did they weep. And these are the original versions of manly men, so to speak, in the pre-industrial era. So we see that this work has been recognized in the past, and maybe it's not so much recognized in the present for a reason. And I want to take a moment here to talk about what is, in my opinion, the worst development I've seen in politics recently, which Full disclosure, I used to call it the conservative laugh react because I saw it pop up on the right first, but now I see people of all sorts of political persuasions doing it, and that is the condescending laugh react, which, if you've ever seen a situation where someone is talking about a desperate fear that they have, a tragedy that they've witnessed, a heartfelt plea that they are making, and someone reacts with one of those little laughing smiley faces. This is unfortunately becoming more and more common in my experience, and I think this is a great example of how toxicity can really destroy the bonds that are supposed to hold us together. So, unfortunately, we can sometimes expect people to have that reaction to our grief, and it's something that I just advise people to avoid at all costs, because if there's one reaction you don't want to have to someone else's heartfelt feelings, it's that. I see a little notification that we have a comment.
So we've got one from Colleen. The notion of consolation is so powerful, letting a higher power's grace enter the equation. We have another comment too when you're ready.
Okay, sure. Yeah, and that's a very good point. When we combine this with our religious practice and with our higher powers, I hesitate to speak on this too much because I know that people conceptualize their gods in very different ways, but it definitely is something that when I am doing grief work with someone, I will bring the higher powers in. And one of the other things that I find to be just the worst is when religious groups create a situation where they are telling people that their higher power is not going to react in a sympathetic way to their grief. That's something that unfortunately a lot of us have probably seen, and it is probably up there with my worst practices for grief work ever. What is our next comment, moderator?
From Kara, I think it's Kara. I feel like saying something like powerful people or warriors sounds more appropriate than manly men for the point you were making.
That makes sense. That makes sense. I sometimes in these workshops tend to make that point specifically because I've known a lot of men who, whether they spoke this or not, did have this sense that they specifically were not allowed to do grief work or be vulnerable because of our culture's ideas about toxic masculinity. But it is very true that I like to hope most of us feel that warriors are of all genders, and that, it's very true that grief work is a very warriorly and powerful thing. If I call out our male brethren, it's perhaps because I've known a few of them that struggled with this specifically because of how they were raised around masculinity. But it's very, very true that it's a powerful thing, it's a warrior thing, and that is not restricted to any gender. And I wanted to take a moment here. We are streaming on YouTube, so anything that anyone shares in the chat will be streamed. You're still welcome to share if you would like to share with the group to put a voice to anything you might be grieving for. I've named here some things that have felt very close to me recently, and that I think might be common experiences for a lot of pagans. I'm definitely feeling some grief for relationships that cannot be what we want because of religious differences, for the destruction of natural ecosystems. I feel like that's very acute right now. And for community and teachings that we perhaps expect in our blood and bones, but that we are not given because of the way our society is currently structured. I see we have some comments, moderator.
No, none at this time. Just agreeance with the point on powerful people and warriors, and me letting the participants know that they can be unmuted if they wish, and to just let me know to interact with the experience.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, and I do agree with that point as well. And I'm just going to hold space for a few moments for some of us to kind of feel into what we might be grieving for as well. And it looks to me like are the cameras automatically disabled, moderator?
Yes, they are.
Okay, good to know. I wanted to make sure everyone knew how to do that if it wasn't already done. All right, how is everyone feeling? Does anyone have any burning thoughts they'd like to share? All right, we'll move on. I have planned probably slightly more content than we will have time to cover today, but that is okay, and this PowerPoint slide will be available to moderator. If you actually want to share the website, Catherine Carr, spelled like my name in this chat.org, there is a sign up sheet then. If anybody signs up on the mailing list on my main page, I will email this presentation, and it does contain some additional exercises and references that we may not get to in this time because I want to make sure we don't rush. And sometimes in our culture, we might even have difficulty articulating the things that we have grief for. There are certain things that it's considered normal to grieve for, and there are other things that we might not even realize are possible to grieve for because perhaps they are. Gate 4 is a great favorite of mine. This is a list of the 5 gates of grief, which is articulated beautifully in The Wild Edge of Sorrow. It's a book by Francis Weller. And number 4 really speaks to me because it's grief for what we expected but did not receive. I think that's something that, because of living in such a sort of isolationist culture, many of us might have feelings about and might not even have been told that that's a thing. I see a little pop-up. Looks like we have a comment.
Kai, or Kay, grieving the loss of lives, homes, forests, and animals in the fires.
Amen. Amen. Yeah, we have grief for the loss of what we love, and we have grief for the world's sorrows, and sometimes those really come together. So this is a wonderful book that I think helps articulate some of the things. And something that I want to say is I've talked a lot so far about the importance of doing grief work, which might have us feeling like there's one emotional note that's being hit. But the reason that I'm talking about this is that there are transformations that happen when we do this work. It's not we go into grief and we stay there forever. It's we go into grief and we come out of it on the other side different. And if we go into it as families or as societies, we come out on the other side different. And I would hope, and to my experience, we come out better. So this isn't just going into grief for the sake of grief, in the same way that it's not just get over it as fast as you can. It's we want to do this work and we want to use it in the best ways that we can to make things better. Do we have a comment here? That's an excellent question. You are probably all seeing the Zoom chat because I just figured out how to open it on top of my PowerPoint. I'm tech savvy. But yes, when grief turns into resentment, that is an excellent question. And it's a major reason that I felt it would be important to talk about grief work today, because in my experience, and this again is just in my experience, resentment often comes when the grief process cannot be completed. When maybe we feel like we can't grieve because we are not allowed to, or because there's no point. And when that happens, we can't fully let go of whatever it is that we're grieving. We can't kind of move past that point, which is something that we want to do. I always find it very suspicious when someone tells me that I need to be more forgiving and they happen to be someone I disagree with about something very important. But it is true that when we feel the kind of active resentment that is inhibiting our thoughts, or maybe I have a mentor who loves to say, allowing someone or something to live rent free in our brain, it is often because we actually haven't finished the process of grief work. And one of the things that I'm going to address is how to grieve together when you're grieving over irreconcilable differences. That is a very difficult thing. Sometimes because one party isn't willing, it might be impossible, but it can be very transformative if it can be managed. So that is coming up in a slide soon. All right. So we have a writing exercise here. I'm going to suggest that we not do it right now, but perhaps later when you're viewing these slides on your own, because we are running a little short on time and I want to make sure we get to some more important points. But these are writing exercises that are designed to be free writes, where you take a piece of paper, a real piece of paper, and a pen or pencil, not a keyboard, because the act of writing with paper and pencil actually interacts differently with the brain and engages it in a different way. And we just start with these prompts and we keep going for 5 or 10 minutes without stopping. Eventually, you might find that some of the things that come out of your pen or pencil don't make a lot of sense, but some of them might be things that make a lot of sense and are surprising. And both of those are indicators of things that are going on inside us that perhaps we haven't been looking at. So that is the purpose of this writing exercise that I'm going to offer to everybody who might want a way of kind of accessing some of these things that perhaps they have been not making space for or discouraged from making space for a long time. And the sixth gate of grief is possibly my other favorite because it is so under-addressed. This was articulated by Rachel Rice in a Facebook post, actually, I believe. She's a wonderful, wonderful worker and writer, and I very much encourage everyone to follow her on Facebook. And the sixth gate of grief is grief for the harms we have done. because let's face it, nobody's perfect. And the more we feel the need to be perfect, the more opportunities for improvement we miss. This gate of grief can look like a lot of things. There are things related to us having to live in a society that creates a lot of waste and destruction, and in some way be complicit in that. And it can also look like much more personal things, things where maybe we know we've screwed up in a relationship or something. And that is something that, again, in order to transform, we want to grieve for. We want to be able to say, you know, this is the way it is, and I need to feel how much I don't want to, again, I don't want to go into bypassing and say, I want to feel how much better it could be. But when we feel how painful the current circumstance or past event is, that helps us to make the change that needs to happen. Moderator, how are we doing on comments?
So we do have a comment and a couple of questions, or a couple of comments and a question. So Kara has said, number 4 is the exact grief I think on a lot, and what is affecting me very much lately. Basically, the grief of what could have been, of what I thought my life would be, and that didn't come to fruition. I also have some sort of future grief, what I want when that appears I'll never get. And then we have another comment from Kai or Kay. I feel that there is no end to my grief for climate change and the degradation of the planet. Tara has a question. Do you have any insight into grief fatigue? And then there is another question after that.
Thank you. Thank you. Grief fatigue is a really difficult one. It is something that I am not licensed to handle. I am mostly sharing what I've learned from experience. I have worked in healthcare settings, and I know that is a very big thing, especially there, especially right now. And what I hear the doctors and nurses and their counselors saying is, you just really have to remember to take self care. And there can be times when that can feel even selfish or indulgent to some of us to say, you know, this thing is happening, but I'm going to take a little vacation from it. But the truth is that if we don't take care of ourselves, we cannot do anything. I have a line later in this presentation that if you are someone who is feeling overwhelmed by grief or depression, that is the exact sign that you are the warrior this society needs, because the people who are getting overwhelmed are the people who care. And the more overwhelmed we feel, the more of a sign that is that we are necessary and we need to take care of ourselves first. Because if we burn out or give up, we can't help anyone, you know. And I have to say, I do think this specifically applies to social media. I am someone who has at times been really glued to the news feeds about all the horrible things that have happened. And it is a matter of all things in moderation, you know. We don't want to be oblivious, but when we are in that space where we are so exhausted just from hearing about the things that are happening that we don't feel we can muster the executive function and the time and the energy to actually do something about them, that is the point at which we are probably over-informed, if that makes sense. Does anyone have any other comments about that? Because I know that's a very difficult question that we're all working through together as a society right now.
There is a comment from Colleen grappling with resentment and personal responsibility, as well as intergenerational trauma, all have a lot of overlap with 12-step work. Tara says, thank you. Cat B says, my executive function is the first thing to go. And as a comment to your most recent thing you said.
Yeah, it's definitely something that I think a lot of us might experience recently between the social media floods and the floods of things that are happening. All right, well, if we have no more burning questions or comments, I want to take a moment to briefly look at this is a writing exercise that I first encountered. Desiree Coutinho and Holly Truhar, who wrote a psychology article that went viral recently. I'm not sure if I can actually say the full title of the article on YouTube, but if you Google Holly Truhar, Holly Truhar, you will find it. And so that is her work, and they introduced me to these writing exercises, which are the same premise as the last one, to bring out the things that we perhaps regret doing or are sorry for, or that are just painful for us. And there are some things that I noticed when I did these exercises that I wanted to share, which is that if you have trouble answering one or more of these questions, those might be areas to look into if they're areas where you just feel like there's a wall there or a blank. Another thing that I found myself doing was saying I was sorry for things that either were not my fault or were actually appropriate actions that I took. And that was a very interesting clue for me to be mindful of where I place responsibility, because it's always tempting for us to feel like we should be the one to fix things. But when we have that attitude, we're actually not necessarily holding people accountable who are perhaps doing harms. I also noticed that I felt better after doing that writing exercise rather than worse. Even though it brought up some painful things, it was like there was a relief there now that that pain had been experienced. I see we have a ping in the comment section.
Just posted the website, hollytruhar.com.
Okay, thank you so much. And I wanted to take another moment for all of us to think and to share, if we are comfortable sharing on the YouTube stream, if we want to, put it out there into the universe, to think about what we need to do grief work for. And something that I really wanted to emphasize is that nothing is too big and nothing is too small. I often hear people say, this is such a little silly thing, but it just really upset me. But the truth is, a massive change is nothing but a whole lot of little changes. So, whatever comes to your mind, it's not too big, it's not too small, it's not incorrect. If it's coming to your mind, it's something that there is some work that if you do grief work around, you might notice some really interesting changes in the way you feel and even in the way you behave. I know I notice when I do a lot of grief work that I actually become a lot more grateful. And it's interesting because it's not like I'm entering this work for that purpose, but it's the effect that it has. So I guess it's those neurotransmitters. And I just want to hold space for us to do this for a moment. Moderator, how are our comments looking?
No comments right at the moment.
Thank you.
We are at the 12-minute mark here. We'll try to wrap up in about 5 minutes.
All right. And astonishingly, I think we've gotten through the most important parts of the presentation. So I want to give everyone another moment or two to think about this and maybe do some writing exercises on your own time if you'd like to. And then I'm going to be here for questions for the 10 minutes or so that we probably have before the next presenter needs the room. I'm going to try to pull up the chat panel myself so I can see if we have any questions. All right. And Kara or Kara perhaps asks, how do we give ourselves permission to grieve? Sometimes we need to know that we can grieve and let something go, but can't let ourselves get to that point. That is very difficult. And I think the thing to recognize about that is that I have not yet found an easy answer. I myself have been doing some grief work this past week about something that has been in my life for more than 10 years, but I was holding out hope that, maybe it can be the way that I want it to be. Maybe we can get past this situation. And just this week, it really started to come out that that isn't going to happen and that this situation is not going to be what I had hoped that it could be. So I just want to put that out there and acknowledge that that happens. And that is sometimes it's okay, and sometimes I think it might be unavoidable just because of the way that our minds work. So I would say it is always okay to grieve. There is never a time where that is silly or not the right thing to do. It, in my experience, virtually always helps, but it doesn't always come right away. Things can be processed over time, and sometimes that's okay too. Sometimes if it's really bothering you a lot, it's probably a good thing to look into how to expedite that process, but delayed grief is totally a thing too. We have another commenter, PSPP, who says that personally they have found that the longer we hold off processing grief, the worse it is when it surfaces. And it's true, it can sometimes surface in a forcible and uncontrolled manner when we don't process it. And I would ask them the same question. Have they encountered any ways to bring things to the surface that perhaps are reluctant to come up of their own accord? I guess I can say the best thing I've found is writing exercises. When I journal, I often articulate thoughts that I did not realize I had. So that can be very useful. It really can be very useful. And some of these writing prompts are kind of designed to allow that as well. Although, in my experience, just journaling about how we're feeling about an event that's on our mind, can be even more powerful. I'm a writer, so I might be biased, but that has been the best tip I could probably share to try to deal with things that perhaps are not demanding the attention they deserve.
Okay, there's one last comment here that says some from Colleen. Actually, there's two. One from Cat B. As an empath, I often find myself experiencing the grief of others. Is this something you've worked with? And then from Colleen, sometimes we're in denial for a good reason, just not equipped to process or come to terms with reality successfully. Well, we have about 2 more minutes to address those.
And that is 100% true, what Colleen says there. Maybe there's a reason that it's not coming to the surface. Maybe I think it's a fine line to tell, is this something that is being repressed for a bad reason, or is this something that is waiting for a good reason? And that is 100% true. You know, the thing that I've been dealing with is something that 10 years ago I probably did not have the tools to deal with in anything resembling a harm reduction kind of way. So that is entirely possible. And as for Cat B, yes, that is so much a thing. And that is also true. That is also true. Sometimes we can't afford to let ourselves go through grief because we just can't do the things we need to do and still go through that. For empaths, I am an empath, and I do have to say that shielding and boundary work has been essential for me. That was something that I actually refused to do for the first 20 years of my life because I kind of had this feeling that it was virtuous to feel everyone's grief all the time and that someone had to fix the problems, so I had to be concerned about them. And the one thing I will say from experience is that I did have to learn to do energy shielding, and I did have to learn to do boundary work in relationships because I ended up getting into a situation by trying to solve everyone's problems where I wasn't even able to solve my own problems. And I did eventually come to the realization that that was so unsustainable that it really wasn't helping anyone in the long run. So if there are any empaths out there who are feeling like they don't want to do boundary work, they don't want to do energy shielding, I personally recommend it. I learned the hard way, and I'm not sad that I did, but I am definitely happy to pass along that experience.
Thank you, Catherine, so much for presenting for us today. If there are any more questions, how can participants reach you?
So the website catherinecarr.org is it has a contact form and it has a mailing list form. The contact form is probably best for questions. I also do offer some one-on-one work, which you'll see if you poke around the website. Um, and thank you, everyone, especially the folks who called me out for using language that might reinforce racial prejudices and for using some very gendered language. I definitely am going to give some critical thought to how we can present those in a different way next time. So thank you so much, you guys.